Olá, bem-vindas, bem-vindos e dou as boas-vindas, especialmente ao nosso convidado de hoje, que é o Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib. O Ahmed fala com a gente da Califórnia, pertinho de São Francisco. Ele é cidadão americano, nascido em Gaza. O Ahmed é analista político especializado em Oriente Médio, com mestrado em estudos de inteligência na American Military University. Tem contribuído intensamente, sobretudo desde o 7 de outubro, com a imprensa americana, israelense, árabe, por aí vai. Excepcionalmente, então, essa nossa conversa vai ser em inglês, com legendas. Ahmed, welcome. It's really great to have you here. A real pleasure. I was briefly introducing you in Portuguese, but I haven't given many details because I think it's much more powerful if you do it, telling what took you to the US as a teenager and why you ended up finishing high school in America and becoming an American citizen. Can you tell us your story?
Well, thanks so much for the intro, Leila. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Ahmed. I grew up most of my childhood in the Gaza Strip, but I came to the United States when I was 15 as an exchange student. It was a post 9/11 initiative by the US government, the State Department, to bring young Middle Eastern students from Arab and Muslim countries to the United States, go to high school here for 1 year, live with an American host family, and then go back to your native country and hopefully build cultural bridges. So I came here to California in 2005, 1 month before the withdrawal of Israeli settlements. Unfortunately, things devolved in the Gaza Strip such that we had the parliamentary elections of Hamas and then kind of like a slowly brewing civil war between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas in Gaza. But when I finished the program here and I attempted to go back to Gaza, I was stuck in Egypt, unable to cross into Gaza from Egypt in June of 2006. That was when Hamas and other groups conducted an operation in which they abducted an Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, and he was in Gaza for 5 years until 2011. But that resulted in a mini war that got the borders closed. There was also the Lebanon war in 2006 in July between Hezbollah and Israel. And so I was stuck, unable to go back. Finally, with the help of American friends and my host mother here, with whom I had lived for 1 year, they worked to support me in figuring out a way to come back to the US, finish high school, and I started applying for political asylum. Thankfully, I proceeded, and ironically, I got my asylum interview took place on June 14th, 2007, which is the very day that Hamas took over the Gaza Strip. They ejected the Palestinian Authority forces from there. And I got asylum in 2008, the green card in 2009, and I became a citizen in 2014. Matter of fact, in 5 days, I'll be celebrating my 10th anniversary of becoming a United States citizen. And so here I am. I went to undergraduate education for my bachelor's. I went to University of San Francisco. I got a degree in marketing and business administration. And then for my master's degree, I wanted to kind of understand national security and kind of the global security architecture. And that's why I pursued a degree in intelligence analysis and operations to really understand kind of the underbelly, if you will, of how the global order works. And here I am. I have family in Gaza. Unfortunately, most of my immediate and extended, I have kept in contact with a lot of people over there, but I've been blessed to be in the United States and do well for myself academically, professionally, socially, and otherwise. And I'll just conclude with saying that my regular job for the last 10 years or 11 years, I've been working in the nonprofit sector. And for the last 8 years specifically, I've worked in international development. So that's a little bit about who I am.
Those who are familiar with your work, with your articles, with your posts on social media, They know you disapprove of Hamas and that you criticize Hamas very strongly. For those who are getting to know you today, now, what's your take on Hamas? How do you see Hamas?
Well, the dominant narrative that Hamas puts out and that so many embrace is that it is an organic expression of resistance to Israeli occupation and decades of injustices and displacement. And Hamas sort of positions itself as kind of the flag bearer, as the primary kind of pull for Palestinian resistance. Of course, engulfed in an Islamist ideology that believes in combining sort of the ideology of Islam with politics and governance, kind of the opposite of secularism, if you will. And so the thing about Hamas that most people miss, and it came out of the underbelly of the Muslim Brotherhood, if you will, starting in the late 70s, but really in the 80s. There is the Mujamma al-Islami, the Islamic complex, if you will, in Gaza, which was allowed to operate by the Israeli military governance at the time Gaza was fully occupied by Israel. And so the interesting thing is that, there's enough historical evidence that supports the idea that Hamas, in a way, was kind of indirectly at times and at times overtly allowed to grow and fester to present a religious counterweight to the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat, and the secular Palestinian national movement, if you will. And so Hamas, unfortunately, brings together the toxic elements, if you will, of nationalism and Islamism, in terms of seeing the trajectory of Palestine as it's not just resistance to get a Palestinian state, but at least early on in its history, wanted to make sure that that state is Islamic and it is going from the river to the sea. As time has gone on, Hamas has moderated its views to try to sound more reasonable and to try to say, even up to, they keep flip-flopping back and forth on whether they'll accept the 67 borders or not, and they'll accept them temporarily, but not really. So Hamas engaged in horrific terror acts and suicide bombings in the 1990s. It started in 94 following a massacre by a Jewish extremist in Hebron, but really it became a solidified violent political program to undermine the peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians during the Oslo Peace Accord, where the Palestinian Authority was established. There was a pathway towards a Palestinian state and sovereignty. And of course, Oslo was full of problems and challenges, but it was nevertheless a viable option, a viable framework that I think the Palestinian movement could have absolutely used to consolidate their presence on what remains of their territories. So Hamas, in a way, wanted to undermine that because they didn't believe in a two-state solution. They didn't believe in the 67 borders. They didn't believe in living side by side next to Israel. And ironically, and they also, before I go to today, Hamas has hijacked rather the Second Intifada. They militarized the Second Intifada, and through numerous dozens of suicide bombings and active shooter attacks against Israeli civilian targets, they solicited violent reactions from the Israeli military, including in 2002 after the Passover massacre in April of 2002, which was also done to undermine the Arab Peace Initiative, whereby the Arab states offered normalization of relationships with Israel in exchange for the withdrawal of occupied territories and the establishment of a Palestinian state on the 67 borders. So Hamas, time and again, kept sabotaging any effective opportunities, even if Israel initially, wasn't on board fully. Like every time the Palestinians, with Arab and international support, would come up with a program to try and push something forward on political and diplomatic grounds, Hamas would come in and sabotage that and undermine that. And then Hamas criticized Oslo and the Palestinian Authority, but then they decided to participate in the Oslo framework in 2006 by agreeing to be part of the elections, the parliamentary and municipal elections that took place. And they won. They won a majority, but it was not an overwhelming majority, and it was both in Gaza and in the West Bank. And that's when a slow brewing civil war began taking place between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, because Hamas now was part of the Palestinian kind of political framework that was built on the Oslo peace process that required the renunciation of violence and the acceptance of Israel's existence and kind of the full commitment to a political process. But instead, Hamas naively, and I would say actually nefariously, thought that it can bring its violent armed resistance into that political framework. So we have a saying in the United States, they wanted to have their cake and eat it too. They wanted both worlds at once. They didn't know that you can't be a resistance group while also being a government. You can't be trying to develop the Palestinian territories while also trying to launch violent attacks against the Israeli military, or often Israeli civilian targets through the use of these unguided rockets that are launched at various Israeli towns and cities around Gaza. But as time has gone on, these rockets reach farther. So Hamas has brainwashed so many people into believing that it is, in fact, an organic expression of resistance, when in fact they are a political group, and just like any political group, they have specific goals, specific ideologies, and very narrow kind of programs that are not representative of the broader interests of the Palestinian national movement. And furthermore, I would say, without any, like, while I believe in the legitimate right to resist occupations through effective means, I think Hamas has absolutely engaged in terror acts that are incredibly harmful, immoral, wrong, and unjustified, and do not only are they wrong and just unethical and illegal and criminal, but they are incredibly ineffective in pushing the Palestinian agenda or the Palestinian program forward, and they fail to achieve anything for Palestinians except bringing upon more death and destruction and more occupation. And it's ironic, I'll conclude this, but with this, like, it's ironic that a resistance group that claims to be fighting for the liberty of its people regularly gets its people killed and more of their land occupied by the Israeli military.
And how is Hamas actually perceived by most Palestinians? Do you think many people share your vision?
Well, there will always be supporters of Hamas on ideological basis, or people who are just never going to rid themselves of the propaganda that the group puts out there. But think of it as an onion, if you will. And let's talk about first the support for Hamas, and then we'll talk about the opposition for Hamas. So think about the support for Hamas. Think of it as an onion. At the core, at the heart, there's an ideological support based on the Islamist ideology, based on resentment of occupation, based on the belief that, the Palestinians should have all of historic Palestine and there should be no Israel and there should be no peace. There are a group of people that absolutely believe that. And then you have the second layer of the kind of additional layers, if you will, of the onion. They're patrons, affiliates, and just people that are casually involved with Hamas. Either they just benefit from Hamas's programs or jobs, or Hamas is a government and is a group in Gaza. So sometimes if you want a job, or if you want to work locally, or if you want to, there's a lot of nepotism. If you want to achieve anything, you have to have close relationships with Hamas. And then there are people that are like kind of casual supporters of the concept of resistance. So even though they may not like Hamas, but they like the idea of armed resistance against the Israeli occupation or the Israeli military. They believe that the Palestinians have the right to use all means necessary, including the use of force. And then you have people that are kind of apathetic whereby they're willing to, they might like some things about Hamas, but they likely, don't have a direct membership or affiliation with the organization. So again, think of it as tiers for who supports Hamas. And some of that might be practical. Some of that might be ideological. Some of that might be casual. Some of that might be apathetic support for Hamas. And then on the other side, in terms of who opposes Hamas, you have, for example, you have hundreds of thousands of Fatah members. Fatah is the counterparty. There are two duopolies, Hamas and Fatah. There are other political parties, but the West Bank Palestinian Authority is dominated by Fatah. And, obviously Hamas is in Gaza. But when Hamas ejected Fatah, you have a large number of Fatah members who are like ideologically just inherently opposed to Hamas. So that's the core of the opposition is like alternate political parties and groups. And then you have people that oppose Hamas because they genuinely think that the group is ineffective and the group's program is it's basically kind of wasted years and years of what we could have had, trying to get what we could have had in the 90s if we stayed with Oslo and if we didn't go undermine the peace process through Hamas's suicide bombings. And then you have people that oppose the group because they genuinely think that it is immoral, it is criminal, it engages in a lot of its governance of Gaza has been horrific. People that oppose it because it failed to make any meaningful progress in Palestinians' lives and providing basic services, making the Palestinian people in Gaza aid dependent. And then you have people that oppose Hamas because its actions elicit violent consequences, including in the current war or previous wars that get Palestinians destroyed while Hamas hides underground in their safe tunnels. Or they despise the fact that because of Hamas's choices, they've had to live under a blockade and Israeli restrictions, even as Hamas has found ways to insulate itself from the blockade and the impact of the blockade. So there are tiers for, and people that, Gazans have protested against Hamas on numerous occasions, including back in July and August of last year. Thousands and thousands of people protesting against the lack of human rights, the lack of jobs, unemployment, the lack of liberties, the deadlock between the Palestinians, the failures of the Palestinian political leadership. So just as there are tiers of Gazans or Palestinians in general that support Hamas for a variety of reasons, there are also tiers of Palestinian opposition to Hamas due to, practical considerations or ideology or politics.
So, although it may not be desirable, the strengthening of Hamas, you make a point that Israel's tactics will ensure the survival of Hamas. Can you explain why?
For a variety of reasons. I mean, number one is just you need to present an alternative to Hamas as you're destroying them. And so if you want, the population to move away from Hamas, there isn't a viable alternative, not the failure to articulate day after plans. And that's is a big part of why, it's like, okay, you're going to destroy Hamas, but what's going to take its place? A multi-headed, like if Hamas is gone, what takes its place? Like, will the remnants of Hamas then form even more extreme and violent groups? So that's one angle. The other angle, and most obvious one of them, is the sheer destruction of Gaza and the sheer damage and death, including of dozens of my own family. To this day, I have no idea why both of my childhood homes were bombed and targeted, and why dozens of my family members who have nothing to do with Hamas, children as young as 3 and 4 months old, shredded and cut up in pieces, and my aunts and uncles at second home, all perishing and losing their lives and coming out as headless, pieces of human remains. Like, I have no idea how that was a reasonable target for the Israeli Defense Forces to seek to kill. And I think that is a war crime. And I think that I will never under any, even if I oppose Hamas to infinity, I will never excuse such acts that target my family or thousands of Palestinians that have lost their lives needlessly. So I think the unfortunate thing is the overwhelming application of firepower in a tight area like Gaza, knowing that Hamas is going to hide underground while the population is fending for themselves, defenseless on the surface. I think that if people were against Hamas, now they're going to have to, they're going to put that aside, and they're going to focus on how the Israeli military's actions are getting them killed and hurt. So it's, instead of drawing out Hamas, instead of doing a slow and steady sustained operation, as was recommended by a variety of seasoned military and counterinsurgency experts in the United States. You look at General David Petraeus, you look at Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, and the use of precision weapons and precision munitions. And a lot of people will counter, well, there's just not enough assets to carry out, a precise military operation. But that is how you sustainably degrade Hamas's capabilities without systemically targeting so much of this infrastructure and the homes, to the point where most of Gaza is now destroyed. Most of the civilian infrastructure is destroyed. And we also look at some of the problematic behavior by a lot of IDF troops. I mean, not just the killing of people, but you look at some of the videos that they're sharing of themselves on TikTok and social media and other, like there's a clear documentation of mockery and disregard and callousness for the loss of civilian life and the destruction of civilian Gazan properties. And I understand the desire for vengeance. I really do, because of what happened on October 7th. But vengeance and revenge are not winning strategies. And to sustainably undo almost 2 decades of Hamas's control and incitement and penetration of Gaza society, the overwhelming military operation, and we've seen shifts in terms of the ferocity. Yes, like some of the, supposedly it's now in a different, not just supposedly, it is in a different phase where you quantitatively see a lot less firepower deployed, but still too little too late. Most of Gaza now sits in ruins. And I also have just wrote a piece today published a piece rather with the Atlantic today, where we've seen evidence of where the IDF pulls out, Hamas moves in. They're emerging from their tunnels, and the impending ceasefire to do a hostage negotiation deal, you're going to see Hamas put their uniforms back on, come out in Gaza, and assert their presence. And so, unfortunately, I am worried that all of this death and destruction is going to be for practically nothing. You degraded Hamas's military capabilities, but the group is adept and resilient and is able to recycle unexploded munitions and destroyed materials to reconstitute its power and assets.
The subtitle of this very article you've just mentioned is, if the international community doesn't want to see Hamas return to power in Gaza, it must act immediately. What exactly must be done, in your opinion?
Well, I think first and foremost, we should, seek to minimize the impact of this war on Gaza's civilian population. We should seek to provide alternative, just to give people hope, to give people food and access to medicine and commercial goods that are needed to carry out basic day-to-day life, stabilizing that and finish, ending the war, ending the confrontation, because the way it is being fought right now is not going to dislodge Hamas. There's inevitably going to have to be a political process in which what remains of Hamas politically and administratively in Gaza is either given an option to leave Gaza or to be rehabilitated, as we've seen with FARC in Colombia, as we've seen with the IRA in Northern Ireland, as we've seen even in the PLO in the Palestinian example, and how after they left Beirut in 1982, the PLO was politically rehabilitated to form the nucleus of the new Palestinian Authority that came to Gaza and the West Bank in the 1990s. Most importantly, I think we need, and I have been adamant in pushing for the release of hostages. I absolutely think we should do everything possible to secure their releases. I talked to families of hostages. I've talked to former hostages, and I absolutely think their suffering is horrendous, and what the hostages are experiencing in Gaza, what their families are experiencing, is absolutely gut-wrenching. And we've seen reports that as many as a fifth of the remaining hostages may have already been killed, and for a variety of reasons, whether it was Israeli bombardment or their conditions. So the most important thing, however, is that I think we need a beachhead in Gaza. We need something else other than, because right now Gaza is basically Hamas or UNRWA, which is providing humanitarian aid and support, and other UN agencies, and to a lesser extent, smaller NGOs. We need an executive presence of the Arab, Palestinian, and international community, a security force that can police the Palestinian areas, the Gaza areas that are being vacated by the Israeli military, to prevent chaos, to bring law and order, to support the provision of humanitarian aid. But for this phase, this force should not be tasked with conducting counterterrorism operation. That needs to be dealt with at a later stage, and whether or not that is done politically remains to be seen. But we need an alternative to Hamas to prevent it from reconstituting itself. The Israeli government, led by Benjamin Netanyahu, have refused to articulate any meaningful plans beyond silly proposals like letting Gaza's tribes take over the administration. I mean, incredibly short-sighted. And while I understand the issues with the Palestinian Authority, it's the only hope we have for bringing something viable other than Hamas. And I proposed the U.S. with Arab partners like Jordan, like Saudi Arabia, like Egypt, like the United Arab Emirates, be involved in kind of administering this new force made up of Palestinians and ultimately of Gazans that can be vetted and trained. The United States already does that in the West Bank. The United States already trains Palestinian Authority security forces and helps work with the Israeli defense and military establishments on protocols and procedures for how to do security in accordance with Oslo and other frameworks. So we need a beachhead in Gaza, especially in the north, that can help secure, for example, a site for an ad hoc port, whereby Israel has already expressed willingness to let aid ships from Cyprus coming to Gaza. But you need somebody on the ground in Gaza to secure those places. I've been calling for airdrops of food, dispersed airdrops throughout Gaza, to get food in the hands of Gazans who need it the most right now, because a lot of food is just logistically and from a distribution point of view, it's hard to get it in the hands of people who need it the most. So by having somebody capable of protecting the aid, of helping in the distribution, protecting airdrop zones, protecting the seaport areas, making sure that criminals don't roam and take over as they have already in parts of Gaza. And this beachhead can be expanded later on to allow for the new Gaza to be born, if you will. But right now, Hamas is coming back the minute that the guns go silent and the minute that a ceasefire takes place. And that poses a serious question of, what was it all for? What's the point? If Israel's going to negotiate a hostage deal, as Hamas wanted from the very beginning, to, hostage deal for the release of Palestinian prisoners, and if Israel's going to do that 4 months later, after all the death and destruction, and after 27,000 killed, 8,000 missing, Gaza destroyed, horrendous, incitement and levels of and criminal levels of violence on both sides, what was it for? And so I don't want the sacrifices of Gazans. I speak to Gazans, I speak to family members, and they say that if all of this happens for nothing, then our sacrifices would have gone in vain.
What is your perception of Hamas' conditions to the hostage deal and Bibi Netanyahu's declaration that giving in to Hamas demands would lead to another massacre?
I think Hamas has been degraded significantly, whereby I don't think they're capable, even regardless of their intentions, capable of carrying out another October 7th massacre anytime soon. I also think that Israel is militarily very well known for coming up with lessons learned and devising systems that will ensure better preparedness for the future. And I think Israel is more than capable of defending itself and ensuring that cross-border attacks like what we saw on October 7th don't emanate from Gaza again. I think, unfortunately, there is no other way to get the hostages other than to engage with Hamas politically. However, this could be an opportunity to possibly engage Hamas on a long-term political program that may actually break the deadlock and may incentivize Hamas to be, and the group may not overtly disarm or renounce violence immediately, but if it is engaged in a way like the Palestinian Liberation Organization was engaged for years in the 1980s before the Oslo Peace Accords, I think there may be a political path forward. And while that might seem far-fetched or naive, and Hamas is not monolithic, by the way, Hamas are multiple groups and multiple segments. And there's not just the social arm, there's the political arm, there's the military wing. And even within each of these wings, particularly even the military wing, you have people that have more dominance and more say than others. And there are some more moderates within Hamas. And that's not saying a whole lot, that's relatively speaking. But what I mean is that there might be some elements of Hamas that may be willing to engage in a political process that sees kind of the eventual establishment of a Palestinian state, but more importantly, that sees, kind of a diplomatic political track as the only way forward, given the failures of the military track. The question then is, there are always going to be ideologically inclined parts of Hamas and members of Hamas that are not redeemable, that are not winnable, or not engageable, if you will. So, like, what do you do with those? I think is a kind of open-ended question. But I don't believe that I think a negotiated settlement of the war is different than a ceasefire that freezes the conflict and potentially gets us to a place where 5-10 years from now, we're back to yet another confrontation. So there is definitely a difference.
And for that matter, what do you make of Antony Blinken's shuttle diplomacy and what is now being called the Biden doctrine for the Middle East?
Well, I think Secretary Blinken doesn't get enough credit for trying. I mean, he has an unenviable job. I also think that the United States is in a position to exercise a more assertive role in forcing the Israeli government to work towards reasonable day after plans and solutions and turning this into a pathway forward rather than further intransigence and further entrenchment. And I understand that, the current Israeli government is engaging in its own internal political calculus with, a right-wing coalition and a lot of raw emotions from October 7th. And I understand where that comes from. I really do. And at the same time, the incitement that has been taking place has absolutely been disgusting, unhelpful, detrimental, undiplomatic, and I would say outright criminal of what's happening in the West Bank and the incitement of a lot of settlers to attack Palestinian communities, the incitement against any prospect for any political resolution with the Palestinians, as if somehow that will guarantee Israel's security needs. And so I think Secretary Blinken and President Biden turning this horrendous tragedy into an opportunity forward is absolutely on point, even if it seems unrealistic or even if it seems like a mammoth and a formidable undertaking. I think it's the only path forward. And I commend the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for turning this into an opportunity to really push the Israeli government for not just, promises, but actual guarantees for a pathway forward to establish a Palestinian state in exchange for normalizing relationships between Saudi Arabia and the Israeli and Israel, which would be a de facto normalization of relations with most of the Arab world.
Exactly because of it, some analysts they see the tragic situation in Gaza and the very, very difficult political situation in Israel, as you said, as an opportunity. Because Saudi Arabia wants to normalize its relations with Israel, among other reasons. Do you agree with the optimists who believe we are closer than ever to a two-state solution?
I mean, I go back and forth, right? I, generally speaking, am an optimist, even though I speak of a lot of grim realities and a lot of depressing facts. And that's not to be doom and gloom, but it is to be realistic, because I identify as a realist pragmatist. Nevertheless, I think on the one hand, we have a unique opportunity given kind of the mounting, like everybody wants to atone for this. Everybody wants to kind of figure out a path forward, both in Israel and on Palestine. And I think Hamas, ironically, is also feeling immense pressure, and they realize the disaster that they brought upon their people. And so I actually think now, not a month from now or 2 months from now, but now, they may very well be in a weakened enough position where they might accept a political framework, maybe not all the details, but a political framework that is built upon a diplomatic political path towards establishing a Palestinian state, demilitarized Palestinian state that accepts Israel and lives side by side with Israel and renounces kind of these maximalist goals and objectives that have not only that are not going to be achieved anytime soon, but also are detrimental to the well-being of the Palestinian national movement and national project. And so I genuinely think there's a unique opportunity, and also the Palestinian Authority is eager to kind of see a rejuvenation of political efforts. It has been a willing negotiating partner for years and sidelined deliberately by Benjamin Netanyahu, who used Hamas to keep the Palestinians divided. So I think there's absolutely a willingness on the Palestinian Authority, and kind of like a lack of an alternative on the part of Hamas to engage in a political track. I think the international community and the Arab world, after all the death and unspeakable suffering and really war crimes, I think, in Israel, just as Hamas committed war crimes, Israel has absolutely committed war crimes. I mean, look at what happened to my family again. Like, I'm not talking from a theoretical point of view. Like, you will never convince me that killing a bunch of civilians was a legitimate military objective, whether it was a mistake, whether it was bad intelligence, whether it was targeting something that nobody else saw. It still doesn't give Israel the right to target all these civilians. So I think there may also be a willingness on Israel's side, for a variety of reasons, to kind of work with international pressures to push for a different reality forward. It's certainly not going to be with the current government that is made up of some really unsavory characters. And finally, I think the United States, due to political and electoral considerations, due to a variety of circumstances and pressures and a desire to kind of, de-escalate the conflict, the spreading conflict and tensions throughout the Middle East, in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Yemen. There's a will, and due to international and Arab pressures, given the massive military support that the United States and political support that the U.S. provided to Israel, kind of there's like an unusual alignment of players and goals and interests. So I do think there's a unique opportunity for a path towards a Palestinian state and the ultimate realization of the two-state solution. What I have been warning the Palestinian side as well, and I mean that just rhetorically because I'm not like talking to the Palestinian president or anything, is that this may very well be the last opportunity that they have to pursue a two-state solution, particularly given that Saudi Arabia holds the last kind of leverage, if you will, to force Israel into agreeing to the resumption of not just peace negotiations, but the implementation of the two-state solution, no matter how difficult it is to achieve, given the settlements and what's happening in the West Bank. I think the two-state solution, short and long term, in my view and that of many pragmatists and realists, remains the only option forward. I think we need some serious discussions about what to do. I mean, you have large settlements in the West Bank made up of, 40, 50,000 people in Ma'aleh Adumim or in Jerusalem, or like those are not going anywhere. Those are not going to be dismantled. So whether it be territorial swaps, whether it be a confederation or a federalist system in some areas will absolutely need to be discussed openly. And we can't simply talk about the two-state solution as if we're still in the 90s, because that's not realistic. But as a framework, it is absolutely the only path forward. And just to conclude, I have warned that this may be the last opportunity that Palestinians have for really pushing for the two-state solution.
You have written that the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, known as UNRWA, was crucial for your family once you were a kid back then. And you advocate that the agency should not be defunded, but reformed. What exactly should change?
I think what should change is just better vetting, better standards for their employees, better commitments and monitoring of their employees' activities. I think making their employees take a lot of ownership of their speech, of their action, realizing that their acts and speech and behavior reflect upon the agency. I think financial reforms to ensure to cut waste. I believe in paying people fairly. I really do. And I also think there are lots of highly inflated salaries that and incentive structures and systems that should be revisited to make sure that most of the money goes where it absolutely is needed. I think UNRWA got, like the United Nations in general, but UNRWA just in particular, their whole thing is to work with whoever is the governing party on the ground. And that's true in a variety of conflicts that the UN operates in. But I think the UN, after years of operating in Gaza, it unfortunately became too comfortable in working with Hamas and not delineating kind of the boundaries and the parameters. And that's not to say, I mean, there are some exaggerations that like to make it seem like all of UNRWA is Hamas. And that is just absolutely false and utterly horrible propaganda. There are incredible people, hardworking folks who risk their lives. UNRWA, over 140 UNRWA employees lost their lives during the war trying to do work and aid their people. It is an incredibly valuable organization that needs to absolutely have strict standards for what kind for the actions, the kind of political engagements, if you will, and the statements and certainly social media and otherwise activities of its employees. And I outlined some of the methods in which that can be done. UNRWA has robust infrastructures on the ground, not just in Gaza and the West Bank, but in Jordan and Syria and Lebanon, where millions of Palestinian refugees live in second-class ghettos, if you will. And without UNRWA services, these people will absolutely have a destabilizing effect, not just on their host countries, but on, Israel will be surrounded by millions of Palestinian refugees who have no hope or no other option. And so I think that's why level heads in Israel actually don't want UNRWA to be dismantled, even though they may demonize the agency. They know that there's no alternative to it. I mean, you can, and there's also like this fallacy that you can just throw money at other agencies and they can somehow come up with the capacity and the ability and the infrastructure to be able to distribute aid and do life-saving work and education and healthcare. And that's just not true. The United Nations is stretched thin to the max from a variety of conflicts in the Middle East, Africa, and elsewhere. They cannot simply increase capacity overnight, or certainly during a horrendous war, to be able to replace UNRWA. That would take years, even if a political decision was made. So to summarize, I would say financial reform, kind of like professional codes of conduct that are not only established and reinforced, but and enforced, but regularly communicated and made clear, kind of like a fundamental shift in the mindset of you're not just a low-level employee collecting a salary. You are part of a hugely important effort that is part of the international community that represents kind of the needs and humanitarian interests of your people, and you cannot be involved in incitement or in terror organizations like Hamas. I think it's entirely doable and achievable, but I don't think that there would be anything other than UNRWA in the short and medium term that could do what they're doing in Gaza.
One last question, and I will begin by quoting you once again. You've written, "Israel killed my family, but not my hope." What gives you hope?
What gives me hope is that I talk to so many Gazans who genuinely want a different path forward. And even, I'll be honest with you, like even the Gazans that may have at one point, supported armed resistance are now having to live with the consequences of it, having been on this repetitive, vicious cycle, are coming to the realization that peace and a political track are the only path forward. I see a slowly brewing shift, and I'm specifically talking about Gaza. The West Bank has a variety of dynamics that are different and complicated and kind of need their own separate session. I know Gaza. I don't know as much about the West Bank, just from context and people on the ground. And so I'm hopeful that people are finally realizing that armed resistance is a futile, useless approach to this conflict, and that 75 years of various attempts to obtain, like 75 years later, we're still back to not only square one, but with less territory, with more death. That gives me hope. I talk to so many Jews and Israelis across the spectrum, not just the leftists or the progressives or the centrists, but even people on the right wing, because I believe in talking to everyone. I will talk to any and everybody. I don't care, period, end of story. I believe my whole kind of model is infinite engagement. The answer to bad speech is more good speech and more engagement. And even folks who are right wing and I would say some like holding anti-Palestinian sentiments would actually, there's a not insignificant number of them that are entirely winnable through engagement and through dialogue, even if it takes time. It's like, I have hope because I see the work and the publication and the engagement and the talks and the webinars and the lectures and the speeches and the demos that I go to. I see people come up to me all the time, people on the pro-Israel side or the American Jews or diaspora Jews, who tell me, I am really grateful to you because you've renewed my hope for peace and engagement. And I almost gave up on, coexistence with the Palestinians after October 7th. I see that on the pro-Israel side or the Jewish side. And then on the Palestinian side, it's mainly private and behind closed doors, but a lot of people are really grateful that I am forcing an anti-Hamas narrative. I mean, it's unfortunate that I'm one of the very few people in the English-speaking world that are overtly pro-Palestine and very clearly anti-Hamas. And not just like anti-Hamas in terms of like, oh, I don't like them, but the Israeli occupation, and I'm just going to keep talking about Israel because everything is, it's all about Israel. I see them as being inseparable. A lot of people want me to only focus on Israel and not talk about Hamas, even though they know Hamas is bad. But I honestly see them as inseparable. And it's bad enough that Hamas was a useful idiot for so many right-wingers in Israel and so many anti-Palestinian forces, not just Netanyahu, but other elements that wanted to see peace undermined. And Hamas beats up Gazans and it jails Gazans and it has killed Gazans and other Palestinians. It has set its people back. It has stolen aid. It is stealing aid. It diverted resources from turning Gaza into a prosperous hub of Palestinian culture and art and a model for Palestine, a future Palestinian state and future governance. And instead made choices that forced a blockade on our people, forced wars upon people in Gaza by thinking that somehow it's going to turn Gaza into an armed resistance citadel. So a lot of Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims, especially in the diaspora, unfortunately, largely privately, but some overtly for sure, and you'll see them on my Twitter feed or elsewhere, express gratitude and appreciation for what I'm doing and speaking out against Hamas and like really trying to separate our people's urgent and just grievances and causes from a disgusting exclusionary death cult and Islamist terror group that has set our people back by decades and held our people hostages. So I'm hopeful that my speech and my actions and my writings are looked at by people on both sides and engaged with. And yes, I get a lot of hate. Yes, I get attacked by both sides all the time. I have thick skin, whatever. It doesn't, like, you know, some of them may come around, some of them may not. Like, I'm not going to be guided what other people project onto me or say or, like, you know, believe. I have never claimed to speak on behalf of Palestinians, but I absolutely share sentiments and opinions that are held by so many Palestinians who either are uncomfortable with the public setting or fear for their lives if they're in Gaza or fear for being ostracized from their community and being attacked in the West. I was just talking to a hijabi woman, a Muslim woman in Southern California, who was telling me how she appreciates what I'm sharing and how she's sad that her family have gone all in on Hamas and she can't say anything because they start going crazy and they've bought into the propaganda of resistance. And she's like, but some younger people are more likely to engage with my messaging and to really, like, kind of have a wake-up call about what the true damage of Hamas. I was talking to this other Jordanian gentleman who was like, the minute I start criticizing Hamas or the resistance, even secular people, even leftists, will start attacking him viciously and say, oh, it's resistance and it's all about Israel and it's all about this and that. So, like, I feel that directly and indirectly, I'm normalizing critique of Hamas and making it clear that you cannot be seriously pro-Palestine while actually supporting directly or indirectly or even not talking about Hamas. So and finally, I talk to policy folks. I talk to people in DC and elsewhere who are involved in day after planning. A lot of, and there are a lot of political figures in different parts of the world that engage in my content and engage me personally. And they are hopeful that, you know, not just what I'm offering, but that this is a moment out of many tragedies and horrible situations. Hope can emerge. That is the way of the universe. Like, people don't develop hope when life is perfect and everything is fine. People develop hope when things are horrible and we're so close to giving up that they kind of hit the brakes, do some work, speak out, write, publish, engage, talk, to develop hope for a better future. And that is how I'm choosing to honor my family's memory. You know, I could have chosen to engage in further incitement and hatred and pushing for violence, but I actually see the honoring of the legacy of my the dozens of my family members, the children and the elderly, some of whom experienced 1948. I see the honoring of their legacy as pushing for a different future forward, so that what remains of my family can have better hope for actually living in peace and without war and living side by side with our Jewish and Israeli neighbors.
Ahmed, thank you so much. It was great to listening to you, and thank you so much for sharing your perspective, your analysis, and your feelings with us.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for reaching out, for having me.
Obrigada a vocês também pela audiência, por essa entrevista. Acho que foi emocionante com o Ahmed. E lembro que esse QR Code que está aí na sua tela é o meio pelo qual você pode colaborar com o IB, para que o IB continue promovendo um diálogo plural e trazendo conversas como essa. Muito obrigada, até a próxima.